traditionally, well, what we're seeing more and more is that our institutions and all of our different customers and commercial as well are having ADFS or Azure as well as Shibboleth. So not surprisingly, ADFS is in place because it works much better with Microsoft's services like Office 365 and SharePoint. And one of the things that, I mean, we can obviously protect Microsoft services with Shibboleth and in specifically Office 365, but you can't, for example, federate multiple top-level domains in Office 365 using Shibboleth, whereas you can do that in ADFS. And there are a few other drawbacks as well. And obviously, using Microsoft products like ADFS or Azure, you're always going to get much better support from Microsoft if things do go wrong. On the other hand, we have Shibboleth implementations a lot of the time, and basically Shibboleth works much better than ADFS with pretty much anything else that's not Microsoft. So you've got obviously all your federated library resources, all the resources in the UK Federation, or any of the other international federations as well. It's recommended by all academic federations across the world, so it's kind of a standard that particularly in education that we need to keep as well. And there's more flexibility with other authentication attribute stores, so not just Active Directory. Obviously, if you're using ADFS or Azure, you're pretty much stuck with Active Directory, whereas with Shibboleth, we can obviously link into MySQL databases, we can link into OpenLDAP, we can link into even custom web services as well. And Shibboleth is open source, so it can be customized more easily. So if there is something particularly that you want to change, for example, going back to the web service, we had a customer that wanted to connect to a custom web service, and we developed a resolver, an authentication connector to connect to that. Those kind of things wouldn't be possible or would be very difficult to achieve with ADFS or Azure. So when we're talking about the various deployment options that we've got, so we can either run ADFS on its own, and this is obviously fine if you're not using any other resources than Microsoft resources, but it's really difficult to run an ADFS installation when you're trying to connect to non-Microsoft federated resources. I'm sure it's possible in some circumstances, but I'm sure there's a lot of service providers on the UK Federation and on the other federations, and even your own internal resources, that they wouldn't support an ADFS SAML connection there, because ADFS has some quirks with the WS Fed, which makes this very difficult. The other option is to run Shibboleth on its own, and we have lots of institutions that kind of accept the limitations of Shibboleth when connecting it directly to Office 365 and other non-Microsoft federated resources as well. We've got a lot of smaller organizations that are running Shibboleth Office 365 without any issue as well. So it does work. And obviously, even if you're a large organization, if you don't need multi-top level domains, for example, running Shibboleth on its own is absolutely fine. And obviously, you get all the integration with all the other federated resources that you would normally have as well. And then the third option really is to run Shibboleth and ADFS together, which is what a lot of our customers are actually doing. And I'm sure a lot of people on this webinar are doing. You have the two separate systems. Because it's essential that you have ADFS for the Microsoft resources, and it's essential you have Shibboleth for the federated resources, and you need both in there to get the best of both worlds. So the problem in having Shibboleth and ADFS running is that essentially you've got two SSO systems, which no longer becomes SSO really, because if you have access to a Microsoft resource, you have to log in to the ADFS. And then if you access a federated resource, or if you've got your virtual learning environment protected with Shibboleth, you're then having to log into the Shibboleth IdP. So you're having to have two logons in a single sign-on environment. So obviously it's not the best case scenario. So one of our customers, which has allowed us to do a case study, is Wakefield College, and this is one of many customers that we've got that are using the bridge. So on this side, they had their Office 365. Which they were using ADFS to authenticate with, and then they had the UK Fed resources and also their Moodle VLE that was protected with Shibboleth. And as we can see that the login pages are both different. And obviously, when you want to make a change on one and reflect it on the other, then it's two lots of changes you have to do as well. So users are having to log in twice at Wakefield before we put the bridge in, and they were also a bit confused with the fact that with ADFS, you had to log in with the domain, whereas on the IDP it was just purely SAAM account name. So, for example, on the ADFS side, it would be testuser@wakefield.ac.uk, and then on the Shibboleth IdP, it would just literally be test user. So they weren't quite sure what login to put in where sometimes as well. Obviously, for new users onboarding, it's another confusing thing. Plus, they've got the two separate login pages. So the solution is the ADFS bridge. What the ADFS bridge does, it effectively modifies the Shibboleth identity provider so that it can utilize ADFS to take care of the authentication phase. So this means that the user from the organization will be logging on to Shibboleth and ADFS SSO systems all at the same time. And it also means then you get that seamless authentication again. So users can go to an Office 365 resource, log in, and then be directed, and then access a Shibboleth resource and just seamlessly move through. And it's also one unified login page, so it reduces that confusion that we were explaining before. So there's literally one login page, which would be the ADFS login page in this instance, or the Azure login page if you were doing the Azure bridge. So you're keeping all that nice unified page, and or obviously still having the nice seamless single sign-on as well. This is just a high-level overview of the ADFS bridge. So as we can see, I mean, this depicts version 1. We do have version 2 that we'll talk about later on. But as we can see, we've got the Shibboleth resources on the left. So that's things like Heritage or ProQuest or any kind of service on the UK Federation. On the right, we have the Office or the Microsoft resources. So Office 365, Link, SharePoint, all those kind of different applications that you would use. And then we've got the Shibboleth IdP, which is communicating with the Shibboleth resources, and we've got the ADFS cluster or Azure communicating with the Microsoft resources. And when a user logs on to one of these resources, it actually logs them both onto both systems at the same time, as can be kind of described by that ADFS bridge running through the middle. And in version 1, both the ADFS cluster and the Shibboleth IdP can both still reference the Active Directory in the same Active Directory as well. So a typical login flow would be, and this is going from the way of a user accessing a Shibboleth resource first, but it would be the same process if they accessed an Office 365 resource or whatever Microsoft resource the user wants to access as well. So the user accesses a Shibboleth protected resource. That user is then redirected to the Shibboleth IdP. And then behind the scenes, what's happening is the Shibboleth IdP then redirects the user to the ADFS server. And then the user is presented with the ADFS login page, or obviously if they're on site and you've got Kerberos enabled, then they just seamlessly log in. And then the user authenticates against ADFS, and then that is then sent back to the IDP. And then the attribute resolution takes place as normal on the IDP server, and the IDP releases the attributes to the Shibboleth protected resource. So it's still an IDP communicating with a Shibboleth IDP, communicating with a Shibboleth resource. And then obviously on the ADFS side, if the user was to access an ADFS resource, first of all, it wouldn't go to the IDP, the Shibboleth IdP at all. It would just communicate directly with ADFS.
That's great, Chris. We've got a demonstration now. I wonder if you'd talk us through this demonstration. I'll just start and let you talk us through it. Thank you.
No problem at all. So this is Wakefield College. We've blurred out some stuff for this demonstration because for security reasons. So we're logging into the UK Federation test SP at the moment. And as you can see, we've been presented with Wakefield College's ADFS server. So as you can see at the top there, it's fs.wakefield.uk/ADFS. So this is their ADFS login page. And we'll now log into the ADFS. And the username just blanked out as well. So as we're logged in, so it's done all those quick redirects back to the IDP and sent us all round, done the attribute resolution as we described in the login flow. And as you can see, we've got affiliation and persistent ID. So now what we're going to do is access Office 365. So we've already accessed that Shibboleth resource, and we're now going to access Office 365. And as you should see, it will just all seamlessly log in without presenting the page again. And as you can see, we're logging into Outlook, and we've just blurred out all the emails there as well, but we're all logged in without having to do a second login attempt there as well. And that's how easy and seamless it will be for all the users. So as I mentioned before, we've got two versions. Version 2's relatively new, but is all ready for production. So version 1, that's what we've been really discussing, and that's what's in place at Wakefield as well. And version 1 requires a direct connection to the AD, the Active Directory server, as we saw in that high-level overview diagram, or a user data store that we can use for attribute resolution. So we don't have to use AD, as long as there's a linking piece of information from ADFS or Azure, we can then do the attribute resolution against the user data store. And this is useful if not all the attributes are in AD or available in AD. So you may have an AD LDS setup that you may want to connect to, or a MySQL database with custom target IDs. There may be lots of reasons you want to keep with version 1. So version 1's not being superseded. It's still a valid version, but it just depends on your requirements. And version 2, now this is going to be very, very interesting for the Azure side. So version 2 doesn't require direct connection to resolve the attributes to AD. All of the attributes for the user can actually be sent across directly from ADFS or Azure during the authentication stage. So we just need to make sure they're released. All the attributes are released for whatever we need to access on the Shibboleth resource. So this means now that when you're moving to Azure, you can actually have 100% uptime using that Azure cloud, and obviously load balancing the Shibboleth IdP in the cloud as well. So you can get a true high availability system in place without having to rely on a connection back to your institution or your organization. And lastly is just the Azure bridge. So this is very, very similar to ADFS and what we've discussed, and it's realistically the same principle. So we can actually bridge Azure in the same way as we do with ADFS. And what this does is it allows you to combine the authentication of Azure and Shibboleth. And you can benefit from all the uptime, as I said before, from the Azure cloud, as well as utilizing the load balanced Shibboleth solution. And you also then can benefit from, if you have the premium version of, which you need the premium version of Azure AD, but then you can benefit from MFA that would also be applied to your Shibboleth resources as well. And using the Azure bridge, it's still the same principle. We can either use version 1 or version 2. So if you haven't got all of the attributes you need in the Azure AD, then obviously we can still connect to another user data store, either AD directly on site or AD LDS or MySQL databases, wherever those attributes would be. It's a very flexible solution.